Greetings and welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. Happy to be here with you again. Got a great guest named Joe Murgia. Grant Cameron identified Joe and a bunch of other guys as the young guns of ufology. We can let Joe talk about that if he wants. But what's definitely true is that guys like Joe, Danny Silva, Juliana Marinkovic, James Ian Doley, Chris Wolford, others they've kind of created or coalesced into their own cutting-edge research group that has opened up a new direction, I think, in a lot of UFO research. And I'm for one, very glad that they're around. Joe Murgia is known as UFOJoe. He's got a blog site or website and has just published a 4-part breakdown, analysis, description of the famous Eric Davis notes on his meeting with Admiral Thomas Wilson, the Wilson Davis notes, the Wilson leak. It goes by many names, the core secrets document. And it's fascinating. I recommend everyone go check it out. I've got links to it below here. We're going to talk about that and probably get into a discussion of a related theme. That is the SNIE document 1961, alleged, maybe real, UFO document concerning UFOs and nukes. We'll get into all of that. But Joe, welcome. It is a pleasure to have you here.
Richard, thank you so much for having me. I've known about your work and respected your work for a long time. I think it was 2003 when we met and had you sign my book, your first book. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. And I think people really want to hear what you've got to say about this. And just a little bit of background, if you don't mind. I'll just take a minute to describe just why these notes by Dr. Eric Davis are so important. Back in 2002, Eric Davis, who is a brilliant scientist in his own right and at the time a member of the National Institute of Discovery Science, run by Robert Bigelow, went on a mission, you might say, to meet with a retired admiral named Thomas R. Wilson. Wilson had been in the Joint Chiefs of Staff back in the days of President Bill Clinton and had been briefed, I guess we could say, by UFO researcher Stephen Greer, Dr. Edgar Mitchell of Apollo 14, Navy Commander Willard Miller. A few other people were there. They talked about this is in April of 1997. They discussed the existence of black budget special access programs to study alien tech. Essentially, that was it. And we know that meeting happened, and then as the rest of the story goes, Wilson met with Miller afterward for a couple of hours, discussed it. Miller, from my take on it, appears to have talked after this to both Mitchell and Greer. This got out among a very small group of people, and 5 years later, Davis meets with Wilson to talk about the aftermath of this. His 15 pages of notes leaked a year ago. I called it the UFO leak of the century. I think I was right on that. And people have been arguing about this ever since. Some researchers, I think, are just running away from it because they don't want to deal with it. But it's a fascinating document, and you have done a deep dive into it. So that's all I will say. I think it's very important that people understand just what this is all about. So what do you think about this, Joe?
I think it's the most important thing that's ever happened in ufology, and if it's legitimate, it's the most important thing that's happening to the planet. I mean, I am just amazed that the lack of interest from some people who are in this field with this, and I know a lot of people, they don't believe it's legitimate, but when I talk to them, they don't even know the basic details of the story. They're like, it's like just basic details. And I call him, I said, do you know this? Like, well, I haven't really read the documents. Have you checked out my blog? No, not yet. I'm like, the biggest story in the history of the planet. You need to read this. And it's not about promoting my work. It's about, like I said, it's that important. So that's really where I stand. And we can go through everything from back in 1997 when I first heard the interview, and then all the points I made in the blog, which it's so huge, it's really hard for me to keep track of everything I wrote. I need to study my own blog because you'll bring up stuff and I'll say, wait, I wrote that? So I stayed up for like 3 days straight finishing this, trying to beat the mainstream media, which we know is on the story. So I'm still recovering from that. But we can go through it point by point.
People need to read the 4 parts. For those of us who are really interested in the leading edge issues of ufology, and this is a big one, you got to go read Joe Murgia's piece on it. It's again, it's 4 parts, and I'm just looking at the test. The title's called The Wilson Davis Documents, and there's a lot of detail. So we're going to do in this first segment here, I don't know how much we can really cover. I think you and I want to do multiple parts. But one of the things that I guess I noticed, one of the takeaways, is you put together a very good, I don't want to call it a chronology, but it kind of works like a chronology. So you lay out a lot of the dates of what happened, when it happened, and so forth, starting with April 1997, the meeting in the Pentagon. And I know your colleague, the researcher Juliana Marinkovic, also did a very detailed breakdown of the chronology of this. And I recommend, I don't know where that's available for other people, but it's outstanding. But you did a fantastic job here. And I guess my takeaway is, the meeting that took place that we have in Eric Davis's notes from 2002. I mean, all the principals are denying this. So Admiral Thomas Wilson's denying it. Eric Davis is officially denying it. But, if an investigator is doing an investigation of a crime, the denial of the main suspect doesn't tell you, oh, well, then he must not have done it. So there are other things that you've laid out here to show this absolutely did happen. So before we even get into all the evidence, can you just describe to people your best take on what happened in 1997, and then how did the whole thing leak out? Can we start with that, I guess?
So, to me, the most important person that a lot of people don't know about is Commander Will Miller. He, long resume. He was a naval commander back in 1970. He had an experience in Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin, where they saw a light that went under the water and then just took off at a rapid pace, and went under the ship and never appeared again. So that was his interest. That started his interest. And over the years, he had an interest in UFOs, so he would talk to people and make it known that he had an interest in UFOs. So throughout people in the government, he would share their stories, and they would go back and forth, and he'd tell people what he knew about it. And then I think he started that in 1989, briefing people. And then in 97, somewhere along the line, I don't remember the date, he met Dr. Stephen Greer. And then 97, like you said, Greer, Miller, Mitchell, Edgar Mitchell, 6 Man to Walk on the Moon, they went to the Pentagon. And at the time, the name was never released. Even when I heard it back in 97 on Art Bell, they just talked about, a joint chiefs level staff fella. So they go in there and they tell, according to the story that Greer told mostly, Greer was the one that broke the story. People have a lot of problems with Dr. Stephen Greer. I get it. But if Greer hadn't spoken out about it back then, I don't know if we'd be here talking right now. He was the first,
that's right. Yeah.
He told, him and the other people who were there, Miller and Stephen Lufkin, who was an alleged Eisenhower era witness, and Sherry Adamiak, they talked to, I don't know if Adamiak was there, but they talked to Wilson and they told him what they had. And
at this time, I guess we should say Thomas Wilson not only was an admiral, but was vice, I'm trying to get the exact title, vice chair of a position known as J2 in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that is head of intelligence. So I think he's deputy chief of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and shortly after that became head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs and director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA. So he was really highly positioned within the Pentagon and Joint Chiefs structure. I guess we just want to make that clear.
Right.
Yeah, so go on.
And so he responds and he says, quote, "I have no doubt all of this is true." And that was basically as far as that's as far as Greer went back then. And it wasn't until September 12th, 2001, day after 9/11, he was in Portland, and he brought up Wilson again. He talked about it, but this time he said the Admiral was told he found a black project about UFOs, and he was told he didn't have a need to know, and was turned away. And he was horrified. If this is true, and I don't know about it, horrified. So that was the first time. And I didn't even know about that until later on. I had just known about the '97 meeting, so I didn't follow along the line. I didn't even know that Greer wrote about it. I had Greer's book when it came out in 2006, where he outs him again. He actually mentions Wilson in 2001 and 2006, and I'm sure Wilson heard about it. He was freaking out. Even with all the denials we know about, he must have heard about it.
Well, I was actually the one who read to Wilson over the phone when I spoke with him in 2006, Greer's passage in his book, Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge, and he was definitely not happy about being outed there. But what's interesting here, so, you point this out, that Greer first spoke about the meeting on May 5th, 1997, when he was on Coast to Coast. He said he had just briefed an important person on the great taboo of UFOs. So this would be just a month after. But this was also before he learned about the rest of Wilson's saga, because really what we know happened, and this is all according to the notes, Wilson meets with Greer, he meets with Will Miller, and after the meeting is over, Wilson and Miller meet because they're both Navy officers with a lot of experience and respect for each other. And they, according to the notes that Eric Davis wrote down, they met for 2 hours. And so it's clearly through Miller that this information came back to Greer and to also Dr. Edgar Mitchell of Apollo 14. So Miller really is obviously the conduit. But I don't want to take away your story here, but I think before we jump ahead, the fundamental issue here is that Greer, Mitchell, and Miller are telling Admiral Wilson, look, there's black budget programs here. These are rogue. They're not under federal control. And Wilson looks into it, and over a 2-month period of time, ending in June of '97, does discover the program and is denied access to it because he does not have a need to know. He's very upset about this. And it's that information in June of '97 or sometime after that Will Miller took back to Stephen Greer and Edgar Mitchell at some point after that. So by 2001, when Greer's talking, he mentions Wilson by name and also adds the additional fact that Wilson was denied access. So I think we want to just make it very clear. And then in 2002, Eric Davis goes to meet with Wilson and takes his 15 pages of notes to lay out the whole story. And those notes sat very quietly among a small group of people. I was shown 2 pages of it back in 2006, and I talked about it a bit at the time, but I didn't have access to them until they all leaked out a year ago. I don't mean to keep interrupting you, but
no,
I just want to make sure that we've got the background before you continue. So you were talking about Will Miller, who really is central in all of this, and he had not really been the topic of much discussion before.
Yeah, as you said, Miller contacted Greer afterwards and Edgar Mitchell and told him what Wilson had found. And according to the documents, Wilson was livid that his confidence had been broken. I don't know, who knows what he told Miller, what he expected Miller to do, but
right.
He was livid at Miller. But Miller is such a key. Miller, I know whether or not that was the right thing to do, it's another very important thing that helped us find out that this happened. And Edgar Mitchell in 2008 started talking about it. And, he started talking basically just that he had met with an admiral. Well, I don't know if he said admiral the first time. In 2008 on Larry King. Well, first it was 2007 on Croatian television, which Giuliano helped set up. He said that this person who he had helped brief said, you're right, these things are real. I should be in charge of that, but I'm not. So that's the first time mentioned that he got shut out. And then 2008 on Larry King, he said, we received the call back and also had found a report, which I think that's the first time that the Wilson Davis documents are mentioned. I think that's the report he mentioned. And he said Wilson, he didn't name him. He said the vice admiral found people responsible for the cover up and told him, you don't have a need to know. Goodbye. Now for me, Edgar Mitchell, the 6th man to walk on the moon, right then. That story's that's true. That happened. There's no doubt in my mind right now. If you're gonna accuse Edgar Mitchell of just making that up, going on national television, that alone for me told me it was, that it happened.
Right.
There's a ton more we can go through, but that right there.
But what we're seeing here is these statements by Greer and by Mitchell. And also, we should get into the statement by Will Miller that he gave in a 2000 interview. Will Miller. I think we should talk about this. But the point is that the story about the Wilson meeting was already coming out in various ways during the first few years of the 21st century. Like, it was coming out. And it was also coming out that someone important was denied access. So the notes that leaked last year, these did not come out of the blue. This account had been circulating among a very small group of very well-connected people for a while, and that's really quite significant. Can you talk a little bit more about Will Miller? You know him personally. You two are on very good terms, I understand, and this came out in your 4-part piece. I was interested in this interview he gave back in the year 2000 to another very fine UFO researcher by the name of Malcolm Hathorne for Tampa Public Access. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, and let me just say one more thing that Mitchell said on Larry King, which is important. He said, they sought me out. They sought me out. That is so important when you go back, when now you start to see what some of the statements Miller said later on, and those are shifting statements, which we'll get in. But so 2000, it's February 2000. I don't know when I met Malcolm, but he had a show on public access called UFOs and Metaphysics. I was a guest on his show one time. I had gotten into the subject in 1996, actually, so a year before the meeting in the Pentagon. But anyway, so I met Malcolm, and he told me he was going to have this guest on, Will Miller, and he was a commander, and he was in the Navy. I'm like, all right, I don't know if I was busy that night, but I lived right by the studio. I should have went, but I didn't. So I watched it at home, and at the end, they took phone calls, and this was a promotion for Miller. Miller was going to Clearwater MUFON like 3 or 4 days later to give a lecture about UFOs. So this was kind of to promote that. So I called in and I asked some questions. And when I got audio recently from Malcolm, I had forgotten that I had called in. And one of the questions, I'm kind of proud of myself. Back then I said, if there is something illegal going on, how do we get to this? I said, Will, how do we get to a program that's illegal? And he said, I would contact my Attorney General, Joe. So that was really great to hear. And it was a surprise. So at the time, I was writing a newsletter, a paranormal UFO newsletter called Open Mind News, and actually quit my job. I was working for the city of Tampa. I was 2 years away from a pension, and I was like, I can't do this anymore. I want to do UFOs and paranormal. So I quit my job, did not get the pension. I was 2 years away from getting vested. Ouch. And it's like looking back, like now I don't regret it whatsoever. After everything that's happening now, I don't regret it. So Will and I stayed in contact. I got his email, so he became a subscriber, and we became friends. Because I would talk about personal stuff on that newsletter. If a relationship fell apart, I would write a journal about it, and Will would talk to me about it. So that's how we got close. So I left Tampa 2001, and I went on vacation in 2000. I think it's 2007. And Will said, you should come over. So I did. I came over, and I wanted to talk about the meeting in the Pentagon. That was my goal. I wanted to find out if Greer was lying, because everybody's like, Greer is lying. So I went to his house and I brought a friend, my best friend from New York, and I didn't really talk UFOs with him because I had my friend with him, and I was like, I don't want to do this to my friend. So Will made us dinner, it was good. He told me, we talked about different things, but not UFOs. So yeah, that's how I met him. Mm. And after that, we messaged back and forth. He's like, yeah, call me. We'll talk UFOs. And I really did not realize how much he knew. I didn't really realize he had done all these briefings.
Well, it's very unlikely that he would have told you about the meeting anyway. That was a very quiet, or certainly would not have told you about the aftermath.
No, you're being too nice on me, Richard. He talks about in 2000 some of the stuff he had done in the Pentagon. So yeah, he wasn't specific, but he talked about that, and for whatever reason, it did not sink in with me. So
well, yeah, actually, I want to read the quote that you pulled out from his interview in 2000. He said, "I've also been involved in the briefings that Dr. Greer has had the lead on, that I've helped arrange in the Pentagon. For example, to the Vice Director for Intelligence for the Joint Staff." He didn't mention Admiral Wilson by name, but that's obviously Admiral Thomas Wilson. and also to the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. That's Lieutenant, that he didn't mention Patrick Hughes, but that's Lieutenant General Patrick Hughes. So he did mention this on the 2000 interview with Malcolm Hathorne.
He did mention it, and why I didn't follow up on it, why I didn't bring this up in 2007 is anybody's guess. But I mean, it actually worked out because for my story that I told, it's a little more interesting. I found out later. I got to visit him again, even though I not visit him again, but I stayed in contact, and a couple of times we wrote, and then all of a sudden the notes dropped, and I'm like, there's a letter from Will, my friend Giuliano goes, there's a letter from Will Miller in there. I'm like, really? I know Will. I know him. And I look at it. I'm like, yeah. I was like, and then I heard people got a hold of him, and he's like, nope, no, that looks like something I would have written, but this stuff looks cut and paste. And I'm like, oh boy, I know Will. I should call him, but I hadn't spoken to him. I hadn't communicated with him since 2016.
I just want to back up so that people understand, along with the 15 pages of notes that Eric Davis wrote. Well, actually, Davis wrote 13 pages of notes, and there was a 2-page letter that was part of those notes, which was allegedly written by Will Miller to Hal Puthoff and Eric Davis about helping them basically do critical research on the UFO subject and helping them get into the labyrinth, as it were, of the cover-up. And so that was part of it. And that's the letter you're saying that Miller denied having written, or he's kind of fuzzy. I mean, I don't think he issued a categorical denial, did he? I mean, it seemed more like, I didn't really remember writing this part or that part or so forth.
The problem with that is they did not have him recorded. They don't have anything in writing. So, it was Frank Stalter and Chan Hanna, and, they talked to him a couple times on the phone and on Skype. So they reported what he said. If they did record it, I don't know. So maybe they did and went back through notes. But yeah, it was wishy-washy. It seemed like he was kind of deflecting and saying, well, it's possible, but I don't remember this. My memory is foggy. But he did not say it was poppycock. He definitely did not say that.
You're referring to my conversation with Admiral Wilson. I guess I'll just jump in here. So in the late part of 2006, I had bumped into this story from someone close to it. I guess I'll just put it that way. And this is when I was shown 2 pages of what turned out to be Eric Davis's notes. So it's late 2006, and I'm reading this. So I found out after Greer published his book that, this is Thomas Wilson. And I found Wilson, and I called him. I spoke with him. I always felt bad about this. By the way, if Thomas Wilson's listening to this, I just want him to know I really wasn't trying to do a gotcha ambush interview of him, but there was really no other way I knew I would ever be able to reach him. So I pretended that I was just doing generic research on the U.S. Navy and his role in the 1990s. And he allowed me to reach him. And I immediately, once I got him, I told him, yes, well, I'm actually researching the UFO phenomenon, and your name's come up in something very important. And he, for the first little while that I was talking with him, he denied any knowledge whatsoever. And then I said, look, I got this from, among other people, Dr. Edgar Mitchell, who was there. So I'm sorry, I know that this meeting happened. And he said, oh, yes, well, I remember, but my memory is foggy. And he said that. And then he really wanted to know about the aftermath, what was known about it. And I said, well, I'll read you what Stephen Greer wrote. That's when he got very upset, actually. He said, well, the meeting happened, but everything else in there is poppycock. His voice got very clearly upset, high-pitched, and he said, well, I have another meeting, and he hung up. So it obviously upset him. He obviously was caught off guard. And the thing is, I felt bad because I could tell even then that this was a man really stuck, that he had encountered a reverse engineering program to study UFO tech, and by rights thought he had the rights to at least have oversight over it due to his position, discovered he didn't, and got smacked down, really got threatened with his career that if he pursued this. So he was in a tough spot, and to admit this would have been an untenable situation for him, obviously. So,
what's really interesting, Richard? Somebody brought up this possibility to me last night. They said, I believe there's a good chance he did all of this on purpose. He wanted this out. He knew it would get out, and eventually he knew he'd have to deny it. But somewhere down the line, the truth would come out, and he would start it by having this meeting. And then I don't know if he gave permission for them to talk about it, but I think somewhere it's possible that he knew this was the way to get this story out. He thought it was so outrageous that, you know, aspects of our government in a private corporation has a piece of a UFO or an entire UFO, and they know that we're not alone. You know, it's a momentous thing to keep as a secret. And I don't blame people. Are like, he's lying. It's like, yeah, the guy has to lie. The guy cannot come out and say anything that you want him to say. It's just the way it is, and people need to stop judging him or judging all the other people. And same with Will Miller. You know, I didn't call up Will. I didn't get his contact information. It was a really tough situation because I'm friends with him. So I waited, and then when I started working on this in April, it was one of the last things I did. I go, I have to talk to him. So I reached out to James Iandoli and I said, you know, Will, can you just contact him and tell him I want to talk to him? And I didn't say bring up, you know, why I wanted to talk to him. I just want to reconnect. So James put us, you know, he got me his email or phone number, and then he said, yeah, Will's willing to talk to you. And we talked, and it was just regular talk for an hour. And then in the middle of the conversation, I go, Will. He's like, yeah. I'm like, I'm working on a huge article. He's like, what about? I'm like, you know what it's about. So he goes, I go, will you answer any of my questions? And he thought about it. He goes, let me think about it. And he said, you know, and his final answer, I think it was on email. He goes, send me 2 questions. I'm like, 2 questions? I got 10 million questions. I'm like, what 2 questions can I ask him? So I'm thinking about all 2. And then he gets back to me. He goes, by the way, I was just saying as a starting point, you can ask me 2 questions. I'm like, oh, okay. So I go through, I came up with so many questions. I had to narrow it down. I'm like asking, is this maybe where the ATIP money went? They said they lost money. Could it have been vacuumed up by another SAP? So I got it down to, I don't know how many questions are in my final interview, which I haven't posted all of, but it's a lot. And he answered every question except 2. And the fact that he did not answer those 2 questions, that's another sign people need to look at. What he was not, it's page 2 of his letter. He's talking about ARVs, you know, alien reproduction vehicles and crash retrievals, all of that information. There's 4 bullet points. And one of them is an East Coast UFO event. He just says, I choose not to answer. I choose not to answer. So people need to think about that. You know, he was giving clues throughout my interview. If people see it, and I will try to post that by tomorrow. Today's Tuesday.
Right.
So yeah. I think he did his best. He cannot tell me the truth, but I think he did his best to leave enough breadcrumbs. If people want to know, if this is true, just that's one of the points they can check out.
I just want to add in support of what you're saying, that I know a few of the individuals who have been kind of close to this document. And it's been frustrating for me too, because they know that I know that they know the document is legitimate. And I've talked with them fairly candidly about it, actually very candidly about it. And in one case, I essentially begged this individual to just go on the record. I said, look, please, you know, there's a legacy here that is important for everybody. And listeners have to understand, I'm not going to throw anyone under the bus. People can put their gray cells together and maybe try to figure this out. But the fact is, I'm not going to. And it's up to them to come out and acknowledge this, but they're afraid. They don't want to come out. They don't want to throw Thomas Wilson under the bus. And also, I think some of them are interested in retaining access to their clearances, because a lot of them have clearances. And we can talk, at least in general terms, about people like Eric Davis or maybe Hal Puthoff or some others if you want.
Yeah, we could talk about how I met Eric Davis. It was I think it was last year, or maybe Thanksgiving of 2018. He had commented about Jeremy Corbell's upcoming Bob Lazar documentary, and he was ripping it. I'm like, so I jump in. I don't know who this guy is. I'm like, Eric. I said, how are you going to rip a documentary that hasn't been released yet? Maybe you should wait for it to be released, watch it, and then give your opinion. So he goes, I don't need to watch it. I already know Lazar's he's a liar. So I write him privately, So we start talking about it, and he's going through why he doesn't believe it. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to write an article on Lazar. I'm going to just, I never really dug in deep on Lazar. For whatever reason, I avoided it. So I had quotes from him. I went through a lot of the points, not all of them, and then it came out 50-50 at the end. And then we developed a friendship. And since then, it's like, he's a real, I would consider him a really close friend. He's somebody I talk to about everything in my life. I'll tell him stuff that I don't tell other people. So I just so happen to be friends with Will Miller and Dr. Eric Davis. So what are the chances of that? It's like, you think of coincidences and synchronicities. Right. That's a pretty big one, Right. And I love stuff like that. It doesn't bother me. It's fun to think about that. Maybe there's something going on behind the scenes. So that's how we met. And when the documents came out, my friends, we saw it and we're like, oh no, this is for Eric. If this is legitimate, he's gonna, he can be in some trouble here. He could be getting some professional trouble, whatever. So we all just let it slide. I don't remember if I waited until they came. I told him about it. I mentioned he would not respond. I just told him. I said, just so you know, this is out. And then they came out on Twitter, and then I asked him, can you comment? And he said, no comment. And that's the first time. Eric Davis is when he writes me, he writes a lot. He is like writing reports when he writes to me, even if it's personal stuff. He writes paragraphs and paragraphs. And I love it. I mean, he's educated me on so much stuff in ufology. It's like the best source I've ever run into. He's the best source, and now I'm close friends. I'm like, how lucky am I? So he would respond, So I said, no comment. That's so unlike him, and that's one of the things. I know how he writes. And I know how he talks, in his voice. And I haven't talked to him, but I've listened to all of his interviews.
Well, no, right. So how would you compare the alleged notes with the writing graph? What would you say?
I know how he writes. I know how he talks. Those notes, when I read them, I hear his voice. That's not evidence. That's my intuition, just comparing. So that's one of the weaker points. But yeah, to me, it's that's him. That's obviously him.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. What would you? We're about halfway through this interview, if you can believe it. There's a lot of skepticism about the legitimacy of these notes. They came out a year ago. There's some really loud, in my opinion, very ignorant voices that just try to throw cold water over the whole thing. Obviously, you and I do not agree with that. What would you say are some of the stronger points in support of the validity of the documents?
All right, I'm going to go over why I believe. Some of these are not for other people. These are for me personally. So I talked to a source who's spoken with a lot of people involved, and they were like, there's zero doubt. This is true. This is a real document. There is a, unacknowledged special access program that has a UFO or pieces of a UFO, and they can't get access to it. Then another source took me through his sources. So for me that's good. For other people, like, yeah, I don't know your sources. Edgar Mitchell.
These are sources talking explicitly about the document by Davis.
There's people that I've come in contact that have their sources, and they tell me in some cases they'll say, who their sources are, but sometimes it's like, I can't tell you who it is, but they have knowledge of this, and these aren't just regular people. These are people I respect. They're professionals. So, but like I said, for other people, that's not evidence. That's just for me. Right. But going through the list, Edgar Mitchell is not a liar. That's simple. These were in Edgar Mitchell's belongings when he died. Why have a fake document among his documents? Makes zero sense. Eric David, yeah, go ahead.
This is just something that we need to hammer home, because it came out a year ago when the documents leaked, and at that time in particular, it was more of a touchy thing to discuss how the documents came out. There's this whole convoluted story here, but essentially the documents leaked out after Edgar Mitchell died. And I think it was Grant Cameron who really put that piece out there explicitly. Prior to that, it wasn't really clear, like, where did the documents come from? And so there was this whole discussion and debate over their authenticity. But yes, it came out after Mitchell died. A lot of his UFO documents were going to be discarded. They were going to be destroyed. And there is one individual, and that person's name remains, I guess, is kept quiet, but who was close enough to the situation and received permission to take those key documents that pertain to UFOs, pertain to consciousness, the Ions Institute that he founded, and so forth. And it was in that this 15 pages were found and then released. So I think we can say that now. So, and Edgar Mitchell was a key part of this whole scenario. It's very obvious why he would have Eric Davis's notes. Like, that all makes perfect sense, obviously.
And I have a quote from investigative reporter George Knapp, and we knew this beforehand, but this was the NIDS group, the National Institute of Discovery Science or Sciences?
Science, I think, singular.
And it's, that's the organization Robert Bigelow formed to investigate paranormal and UFOs and consciousness. And all of these people, Eric Davis, Edgar Mitchell, Colin Kelleher, Hal Puthoff, they're all connected, and they all knew they had to have known about this at the time.
Were you going to mention that George Knapp just gave his own validation of the Wilson Davis notes?
Yeah, he said, in my opinion, but if you read what he said, he's validating it. He knows. He was around NIDS. He's friends with Robert Bigelow. People need to wake up. He's an investigative reporter, award-winning. And the only argument they say, George Knapp believes in the Lazar story. Why should I believe what he's saying about this? And that is so, first of all, we don't know the truth. We don't know the truth of the Lazar story. Sorry, my dog is barking.
That's a propaganda smear. All that is.
We don't know the truth about the Lazar story, but either way, George Knapp's not going to come out and say these documents. I believe these documents are real. They were. People should go read what he says, because he says they were handed to scientists, people who were in the DOD. So it's not. A lot of people know about this. Very important people know about this. This is, like I said, the biggest story in the history of our planet. So George Knapp is just the cherry on top.
I'll just add one thing about George. I spoke with George Knapp, less than 1 year ago. So after the leak came out, and I was at an event, and I saw George, and I've been friends with him for a long time, and I have tremendous respect for him. So we chatted about this, and although he wouldn't put himself officially on a position of those documents at the time, I will just say it was very clear to me that he almost, even then, probably, this is, I think, summer of 2019, believed that it was likely true. I mean, just knowing he knows all of the players in this situation very well, and he certainly knows Eric Davis very well. So yeah, I think George Knapp has been on board, but he was cautious, and I think he didn't want to make a public statement until just now he's made his statement. So I think that's good news. He
definitely did not want to wade in, like you said. He knows people, but now, it's big news that he's given those comments on his podcast, and then he gave me another one. He gave me another one to use. I put both of those on my blog. But then the next thing is, why wouldn't Eric Davis just say it's bull, it's BS? It's like, and you know what people say? If it's not true, just say that never happened. No, he just says no comment. And the argument against that, they're like, well, Eric Davis does not like ufology, so he's been playing a game. He likes to just throw those little things out there just to throw people off, and he's laughing as he's saying it. That's their explanation. I'm sorry. No, you don't consult with somebody who knows about the law and ask them what do they think you should say if you're just trying to play a joke, unless you think he's lying about that too. So yeah, that's another big point.
And actually, I'm scrolling down my own website for the note I received from Hal Puthoff a year ago, which was actually almost used verbatim by Eric Davis after it came out. I'm not sure if I've got it here, but I think you quoted it yourself, actually. But I think it was early June, and Hal Puthoff wrote to me, oh, man, I really should get the whole thing exact, but it was a very, very carefully worded no comment, in which he said, look, those of us with U.S. government clearances cannot comment on these types of matters. So if you recall what I'm referring to, but
yes, potentially classified programs, may have been the wording.
Yeah, can I read it? He says, Rich, with regard to authenticity, we have no comment on the documents recently being circulated, as some of us still retain U.S. government security clearances and remain bound by the secrecy oaths we have taken. We believe it is in the best interest of the U.S. government and ourselves not to comment on any documents that purport to describe classified U.S. government programs or information. Best regards, Hal. So yeah, I felt that was a gift. as far as no comments go, that's one of the best.
That's a great one. And then he lectured earlier this year in West Virginia, and he said, somebody asked him about the Wilson Davis documents, and he said,
right.
just so people know, he's referring to a conversation my scientist, Dr. Eric Davis, had back in 2002 with Admiral Wilson. And we're like, wait a second. Did he just confirm? It's like, did he just confirm? And then you confirmed it with him. And he said, no, I was just loud in there. I was just repeating the question. But, like I said, people can judge for themselves. I'll take him at his word. But read what he said. It's almost like he was giving us he's like, here you go. And then pulled it back real quick.
Well, one thing we have to say is that I've said this all along, and I'm just going to be as careful as I can here. Everyone in that crowd, I call it the Bigelow crowd because really they all formed around Robert Bigelow in certain ways. They all know this document is legit. They all know it is. They are not saying it explicitly publicly, but they all know it's real. So that's all I'm going to say on it at the moment. I should let you continue because I want you to have time to dive into this.
Real quick, so you might know this. Oki Shannon, who's mentioned in the notes, he's the one that convinced Admiral Wilson to meet with Dr. Davis because he said his reputation is stellar, with the clearances, and, he's very reliable. You can trust him as far as not blabbing the story everywhere. But there was a connection between Dr. Davis and Oki Shannon, and you might know that. I know Grant Cameron has notes that were given to him related to that. Do you know about that story?
Vaguely. Yeah, I know that there was a connection. I mean, obviously, because it was through Oki Shannon that the Davis Wilson meeting was arranged. He had a long conversation with Wilson. When Grant saw Oki Shannon's name on the first page of those documents, he said, like, I just turned white, and I knew that I was onto something here. That was a name that was a very significant connection. But why don't you go on?
All right, here's a big one. This is what I'm talking about. People have read the blog and they're like, great job, love what you did, but they haven't taken the time to go through. So I did that this morning. Here you go. So Will Miller's statements, 2000 on Malcolm's show. Miller said briefings on UFOs took place and they were initiated at their request. 1997, Leslie Kean, VSD article. She says that Miller initiated briefings with flag officers. Miller initiated. So it went from they were initiated at their request, then it switched to Miller saying, no, he initiated briefings with the flag officers. They did it at my request. So that's a switch right there. First, they requested it, and then he requested. So he switched in those two different, from 2000. Was it 2000? Yeah, 2000 was, no, not 2000. What am I saying? 2000, yeah, 2000 Malcolm, and then VSD article was 2007, I believe.
Okay.
And then in my interview, he goes, Wilson did it at my request, Hughes requested it. So it went from their request to my request, and then split down the middle to Wilson requested, Wilson did it at my request, and Hughes requested. You know what I'm saying? It switched 3 different times.
Yeah, so we don't really know who requested the briefing. I had always assumed that this was through Greer's just pushing ahead, like almost you could say the bull in the china shop, just moving ahead and seeing who he could meet with, because I thought that was sort of his mission in 1997. But
I think they both requested it. It's just over the years he had to pull it back. In 2000 on a public access show, he was a little less guarded. I think that's the truth right there.
Uh-huh.
Both, everybody, those guys requested the briefing, but now it's like, nope, Wilson did not request it, because that's what Wilson says. He's got to stick. It's got to be a consistent story if they're going to back up Wilson's story.
Well, Wilson and Miller had their own history. Is that right? Or
yes, I don't know how far their history goes back. I believe they knew each other, and like you said, in the documents it says they met for 2 hours after the initial briefing was over. In my interview, I asked Will about that. He said, nope, didn't happen. We did not meet at all after the briefing was over. So that's another thing,
Right.
People who don't believe you say, see, Miller is telling the truth. He's telling you the truth here. This is just nonsense. There was no meeting. It's like, people.
I'm amazed at people who are just willing to believe any old denial.
Oh, I know.
And then they try to turn it around and say, oh, well, UFO believers just refuse to believe any denial. They take a denial as a confirmation. No, it's not that, but you have to look at the big picture, and you have to look at all of the information that's coming in here. If a person commits a crime and everything points to them and they still deny it, does that mean you say, oh, well, yeah, we'll let you off? Like, that's ridiculous. And it's a similar thing here. So, and the other thing about this is quite relevant is General Pat Hughes, who you pointed out in your piece, had his own very strong interest in the UFO subject. So Hughes was Wilson's boss over at the Joint Chiefs. So you could really see a scenario by which Hughes, maybe talking with Wilson about this, and it becomes known that Wilson and Miller have a connection, Miller and Greer have a connection. It's not difficult really to see that there could be a meeting that would be arranged out of all of that,
Oh, definitely. And Hughes, I don't know which article it is where Miller says Hughes had personal experience with the phenomenon, which, you're going to have a percentage of people in the world that had an experience, and that some of them are going to work in the government. So it's like when you see people talk about Jim Semivan in TTSA, they're like, oh, he's CIA. I'm like, yeah, read the forward to Tom DeLonge's book. He had an experience with his wife. Everybody has experiences in the world, and some of them are going to work in the CIA. That's just how it is. Right. So moving on, as far as, what convinced me, that's another thing. Early on, Will Miller said Wilson and Hughes both took their briefings seriously like anything else. It's like, and Wilson even actually, there's a 2013 interview between Miller and Greer where Greer's like, yeah, Wilson he was so interested in the information they were sharing that he kept canceling future appointments. He was telling his secretary, cancel that, we're still going. And Miller is like, yes, Miller's agreeing. Right. That's huge right there, because now, nowadays, Wilson says, no, I did it because I was curious. They said there was some black program, but no, Edgar Mitchell, he's better than somebody off the street, but he makes it so nonchalant, which I'm saying, he's got to do.
Wilson said that to me as well in my conversation with him in 2006. He essentially said, I had the meeting, wasn't really interested. I had a lot of other things to do. In fact, he referred to looking for weapons of mass destruction by Saddam Hussein. He said that was a big part of my job. I'm thinking, wow, you're on that whole thing. But he said, I didn't have time to look into UFOs. So this is really quite opposite.
It's quite opposite, right? And just that alone, Richard, unless... if you think, was Miller lying back in 2013? Was Miller lying in 2000? It's like you really have to go the great lengths to just think that this is all nonsense. Which I really don't understand. But here's another one. This was one I asked Will, and he answered. But people can decide for themselves. Let me just read you what I wrote. I said,
sure.
I wrote him this question. I said, Will, 2013, you and Dr. Greer had a conversation on YouTube. He talked about an admiral who had found one of those USAPs through code names, and basically Dr. Greer said the admiral was told by these USAP folks, well, we know who you are, but you don't have a need to know, and we're not going to tell you anything. So I said, didn't say anything.
When did Greer say that?
This is 2013. So Greer says the admiral was, they're talking on the phone together. It's posted on YouTube. Yeah. Greer says the admiral was told by these USAP folks, well, we know who you are, but you don't have a need to know, and we're not going to tell you anything. So I say to Will, you didn't say anything. You were just silent right there. You didn't say yes. You didn't say, what? That didn't happen. That didn't happen. What are you saying, Dr. Greer? So I said, was Greer telling the truth? And Miller says, I have no idea about Stephen Greer.
He didn't want to get into it.
That is not an answer, though. But that's not an answer. He could have just said, I was there. Wilson didn't say that. Or he could, why didn't he say that? That's in my opinion, that's Miller saying, here you go. I'm going to give you this.
I think that's reasonable. And just to point out what Greer was characterizing in 2013 is very, very accurately described in the notes by Eric Davis. I mean, it's the exact same scenario. And what ended up happening, just so people understand, we're actually getting toward the end of this, if you can believe it, for this segment. We're coming back, you and me. But the scenario is you've got the vice head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff thinking of getting information about special access programs dealing with reverse engineered alien tech by private contractors and being denied access. by actually the three people. He describes them as the gatekeepers in his conversation with Davis, who, by the way, probably recorded this, don't you think? But anyway, so Wilson's denied access, and he's upset and thinking, I'm with the United States government, I'm in a responsible position, and you've got this private company that's essentially controlling this. And that's the theme of this whole. And Greer laid it out in 2013. He laid it out earlier than that, as early as 2001, basically. And the notes that we now have leaked, that were written by Eric Davis, that came from the estate of Edgar Mitchell, they completely support that contention by Greer. And yeah, so Davis meets with Wilson in 2002. There's debates over, was it in Las Vegas? Was it not in Las Vegas? I don't know if we have time to get into that. But it certainly seems to me that this was a recorded conversation. Why do you think it might have been recorded?
Well, I read the documents, and Wilson says, "What are you going to do with this?" And to me, that sounds like he's looking at a tape recorder and saying, Yeah. And then Davis says, "Just personal," and I don't know his exact wording, but talking about research, And then I have my own reasons for believing why it's recorded. And as far as the details that are in the document, maybe it wasn't in Las Vegas, maybe it wasn't in a car, maybe some of those details were changed. So if the document did leak and Wilson needed to make a denial, there were pieces in there that he could point to and say, "I was never in Vegas. I never, I didn't sit in the car in Las Vegas, in 2002 with Eric Davis. I don't know him. I may have met him, but there's little things in there because Billy Cox talked to him recently and he went through the denials again." So yeah, but I think the main story, that's really all I care about. And that's all we care about. Our government, through a private corporation, has this material and maybe a full craft. That's all. That's really all we care about. The other stuff, just if it's not true, I think it was just done purposely in case it leaked. But that's me speculating. It could be 100% true. I don't know. And whether or not what Wilson told them is true, like, we don't know that. People are like, "You don't know that." I'm like, no, I don't know that.
We don't know that. No, it's entirely what we're going on is what Wilson was told by the so-called gatekeepers, and we don't even know exactly. There's a lot of speculation that it was Lockheed Martin, but maybe it was Boeing, maybe it was some other organization. But Wilson was denied access back in 1997. And they told him whatever they told him. They said, "Well, yeah, we do have a craft. We've had painstakingly slow progress on it." That's in the notes there. Was that true or not true? We don't know if that was true. But that is what Wilson evidently clearly told Davis from what we have in Davis's notes. So, yeah, there's different layers where information could be wrong. But the key here to take away is you've got the former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency and former head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff talking to a very brilliant, well-plugged-in scientist about his denial of access to this program. And to me, that's interesting. The other thing I just want to really hammer home before we finish this, to me, Davis's meeting with Wilson was kind of like this admission of the Bigelow group. These individuals around Robert Bigelow from the 90s through the 21st century. In my view, these are people who are very, very brilliant, who have a lot of knowledge of the UFO phenomenon, who talk to each other, who are working or have been working their way through the labyrinth of the cover-up. And it's not like they can talk to just anyone. So they talk to each other and they use what resources they can to get more information. And so I think in this case, you've got the opportunity. They were able to arrange for Davis to meet with Wilson, one of their own, Eric Davis, to meet with Thomas Wilson to get a detailed assessment of what happened. I think that's exactly what happened. And Davis, in this interview, basically hit a home run with Wilson. He got a very detailed statement from the Admiral. I mean, would you agree with that?
I agree. And I know people criticize Eric Davis and they go, "Hey, he flies off the handle. He's got a temper." I'm like, yeah, maybe. But look at the big story here. This guy is one of the smartest people I've ever met. He goes on Coast to Coast. He talks about the legacy crash retrieval program. He goes on other shows talking about crash retrievals of UFOs. This guy has contacts. This guy's made contacts through the years. People tell him something. He explains exactly how he does it. You get in with somebody, you have clearances, you don't have a need to know, but they will talk to you in a SCIF, secure facility. They will tell you stuff in the hopes that you might get a need to know. That's how he's learned about all this stuff, and he shared it with all this. Why would people have a problem with that? Why would you criticize this person? Go listen to the interviews. Go read my blog. And one of the most, not exciting, one of the most, it's really encouraging for the possibility of how we can get inside these programs. This is a quote from Will Miller. So this is on Malcolm's show. He goes, I said, how do we get at these programs?
From a long time.
2000. Yeah. So how do we get at these? I'm pretty sure this is Malcolm's show, but don't quote me 100%. But he says, there have been legal opinions that offer the fact that particularly for programs that may have been created without proper congressional oversight, i.e. programs which were created illegally using taxpayer dollars, and then persons involved in those programs are sworn to oaths of secrecy, that those programs themselves may be, and the oaths may be invalid. If in fact that program is an illegal program. So basically they can talk about it and he thinks they may be able to talk about it and not face any repercussions. Wilson can come out and say right now with other witnesses and not face, and I know it's more about legal, it's not just legal repercussions, it's professional, but on the legal aspect, Miller thinks if it's an illegal program, they can speak and not worry about going to jail. That's big.
That was an interesting statement by him. Of course, whether that would work out in practice is a whole other question. You could say, yeah, it's an illegal program and the government may not agree with you. I mean, what I describe this type of thing as a situation of legal illegality. Here's Wilson going through the Pentagon, the Special Oversight Committee, SAPOC, and this is where the Special Access Program was buried. And he believed it was illegal, but it didn't make a damn bit of difference. He got denied, the ability to follow up on this unless he wanted to damage his career. So I think Miller's statement is noble and honorable and ought to be true, but whether it would work out in practice, that's a bit of a stretch, I think.
Yeah, do these guys want to take that risk is the problem.
That is the problem. I can't believe we've gone through this segment, Joe. I'm actually just kind of amazed because there's so much more. Can I get you to come back in the very, very soon so we can continue this? Because I feel honestly that this requires an ongoing multi-part conversation. If you're willing, I would love to have you come back.
Oh yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I will definitely come back.
We need to do that. Listeners expect more of this, and you're not going to be waiting very long for it. I really think we want to unpack this as much as possible. By the way, I'm a big fan of your colleague Danny Silva as well. I think he does great work on his blog. Juliana Marinkovic is honestly, that guy is astonishing to me, and I'm a big fan and very friendly with James Ian Doley. I know all of you talk with each other, and I think all of you are doing just excellent work in this field. I want people to know your website is just UFOJoe.net.
Yes.
Real simple.
And
UFOJoe.net. I'm going to below. And
I'm on Twitter a lot. Not so much on Facebook, but Twitter is at UFOJoe11. And right now it's hard to keep up because there's so many comments and people tell me I'm crazy and you have no evidence for any of that. And then other people just wanting more information. So it's a great time right now. It's one of the, as George Knapp said, you need to have fun with this. And I have no sleep right now, but I'm having fun. I can't sleep. I cannot sleep. I wake up. I'm like, hey, what's going on? I cannot sleep. It's too exciting, Richard. This is amazing. This is what we put all this time in. This is what we did it for, and it's happening. And I think we're going to these next couple of weeks are going to be amazing.
We did not get to talk about the 1961 SNIE document, the Atomic Energy Commission nuclear document on UFOs. We'll have to get into that next time because that's a whole other controversy. I'm interested in going into that with you.
Yes, definitely. We'll talk about it next time. Documents are not my strong point, but I do believe that one is real.
Yeah, and actually you said you've got a very good, so you can't give up the source, I know, but you have a very good source on this, I know, who has supported this to you. Yes,
and we'll talk about that next time. And there's a lot of people pointing out various problems with that document, and I can't
appear to be like there seem to be legitimate arguments. Tim McMillan brought up a few things, and I'm sure others are critiquing it. But there do appear to be at least answers, whether they're the perfect answers. But I really want to get into that with you. Yeah,
my favorite comment was people are like typo, typo. I'm like, oh my God, you're right. There's spelling typos all over this. So I talked to the source, and then this was followed up on an email list that is online, which I was given permission by Dr. Era Davis to use. And both sources say, yeah, there are typos because the person who wrote the document has a history of typos. We've seen documents from that person. So it's like, that is amazing. The level of, I'm like, people just think, they just
had a history. I'm sure that author's dead by now. I mean, that
yeah, I would think so, unless they were really young when they were doing that.
Right. But so they know who the author is. That's really what the implication is.
Right. Yeah, which is amazing to me. That people assume that they're
You've got people who know who the author of that document. By the way, that's a whole other thing people don't know. But it's a document that essentially talks about the threat of UFOs being confused with nuclear missiles. That's one part of it, which, by the way, was a very key concern among certain elements of the UFO research field of the time. Donald Kehoe talked about this a lot, and it was something that came up with conversations with members of Congress. This actually was a legitimate topic of discussion, and so here we have an alleged document talking exactly about that theme. But anyway, you will have to come back to it.
Yeah, definitely. And, it's like, I as far as, I'm not always great at explaining my points. So you might say, that's really not great. I'm going to summarize all the points and write another blog because, like I said, it's 24,000 words and a lot of people don't have time to read that. So, and I also would love it if other people go through it point by point and point out inconsistencies from these states, just little pieces that we could pull apart. You and I know it's real. And other people know it's real, but for people who are on the fence, if we want to show them, say, here, check this out, take a look. I think, if mainstream media does the reporting that we're hoping, I think we're going to know soon. But in the meantime, I have no problem with people going through and pulling out stuff because it takes a while to go through all of that. And I encourage it.
I'm just also going to give an unrelated shout out to a Mr. X over at Project Unity's YouTube page, where there is a 3+ hour extended breakdown of the Davis Wilson notes. It's really quite a thorough analysis. I think I'm going to link to that as well. So a lot of you guys out there are doing some really amazing work. And yes, your comment about mainstream treatment of this, that is the talk. I've heard about it. I know about it. We're waiting. Will it actually happen or not is really the question. Will there be a mainstream treatment of the Wilson Davis notes and anything related? Maybe having something to do with crash retrievals in general of these UFO/UAP. Wouldn't that be something?
I can't imagine what the reaction would be. Anywhere from, oh my God, this is the most amazing thing. Everybody's talking about it, to people saying, yeah, I don't believe it. The New York. Wow. If you look at one of the people listed in the documents, I called him. Somebody gave him his number. I really don't like calling people blindly, but I did it. And one of I asked him, about the Wilson Davis documents, and he was like, no. I'm like, uh-oh, he's going to hang up on me. But he didn't. And we talked UFOs, and he said...
Wait, this is one of the people mentioned in the Wilson Davis document?
Mentioned in the document, and he said I could write about it. I could not record it, and he said, do not use my name. So I changed, I left some stuff out to make sure it wasn't easy to identify him.
Right.
And so I said, there's a chance that it's going to be in... if you want me to say the name, I will say, because it's related to the story, but one of the main newspapers that are known as being very liberal. So I said, he goes, I don't believe anything. That's a liberal mouthpiece. That's a liberal mouthpiece.
New York Times.
I said to him, it's reported that the New York Times is working on the story about crash retrievals. He goes, the New York Times is a liberal mouthpiece. I wouldn't believe anything they wrote. I said, it doesn't matter where it's published. You got to look at who's going to be speaking out. They may be military and defense, DOD witnesses if they get the people on the record. And he understood. He understood that. Absolutely. But yeah, my notes about that interview are in there. It's hard to do an interview. You're taking sloppy notes. It's like my handwriting is so illegible. I'm reading my notes afterwards. I'm like, what the heck did I write?
If the New York Times or another mainstream organization were to take this theme on, I mean, we can expect there's going to be a lot of limitations to what they can do. But it could also be, if it's done well enough, it could be a definite step forward. So we really got to see what if anything happens and what, keep an eye on it, I suppose.
My hope, my dream would be Admiral Thomas Wilson breaks his silence, admits that he's been lying for the last, 14 years, but that's not going to happen.
That will happen. I don't think there's any indication that that's...
No, that's not happening.
But, the thing again is if researchers are simply waiting for an open admission from people, they're, don't hold your breath, because I don't think that's likely to happen. You're going to get an open admission. So what we need to do, in my view, is look at the evidence around the event and do our best analysis. And I think that's what you have been doing. And yeah, we want to come back to this, Joe.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, thank you to, Danny and Giuliano and Chris and James, everybody. We've all worked together, and you and Grant and Billy Cox for interviewing Wilson. So it's a team effort. And I think we're making progress. I just, I'm excited to see what the next couple of weeks and months and years, bring. It's really exciting. So
UFOJoe, Joe Murgia, thank you so much for being on here for this program.
Thank you. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks for listening. And remember, while we learn and grow and search for the truth, hey, let's be good to each other. Later.